Welcome and bonjour. Great to see you all. This is the Walrus Talks Global Hunger Crisis presented by Cooperation Canada, Canadian Food Grains Bank, the World Food Program, and World Vision Canada. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I'm the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I am pleased to be your host this evening. It is great to be back in person. How's everyone feeling? Also, a big hello and welcome to the hundreds of people who are joining us online via our live stream at thewalrus.ca. One of the ways we like to connect the in-person room and those who are joining us across Canada and around the world online is through social media. So if you'd like to tweet or share with us however you're watching us, you can tag us on social media at The Walrus, and the hashtag is #WalrusTalks. We'd also like to say a big welcome and hello to all the delegates from the International Cooperation Futures Festival. Who's in the room? Let's hear it. Nice. For anyone unfamiliar with the festival, it's hosted by Cooperation Canada, and we are really honored to be part of the festival and to have an audience here that represents delegates, the general public, and people tuning in from home. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on right now. We are gathered on the traditional, unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in Canada's capital city. Ottawa is home today to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And when we think about the land, it can and should feed us. But food insecurity is an issue Indigenous people face here in Canada and around the world. So we encourage you, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're in the room or you're tuning in online, to take a moment to reflect on the land and how it connects to the topic of food, which is at the center of today's talks. A bit about the Walrus, and welcome to anyone coming in. Come in, grab a seat, make yourself comfortable. The Walrus started 19 years ago, really as an optimistic project to foster conversation across Canada. And we recognize that these conversations are complex, but so necessary. And for us, they take place really wherever conversations are taking place. So that starts with our fact-based journalism, which you can find in our print edition, but also online at thewalrus.ca, through social media, through podcasts, and in rooms like this one at the Walrus Talks. And no matter where the Walrus is or how people connect with us, we really embrace our commitment to be independent, to share a diversity of perspectives, and to bring together a community of interesting and interested people, that's all of you, who ultimately care about the issues that define us as a country. So thank you for being a part of tonight's event. This work is powered by and only possible thanks to the support of our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So thank you to Cooperation Canada, to Canadian Food Grains Bank, World Food Program Canada, and World Vision Canada for being a part of tonight's event and making it possible. All of tonight's partners work in the humanitarian aid sector, either directly providing food and relief to those who need it most, or supporting that direct relief. To tell us more, please, a round of applause in welcoming the Chief Executive Officer of Cooperation Canada, Kate Higgins.
Good evening, everyone. It is really wonderful to be with you all here at this Walrus Talks on the global hunger crisis. I would also like to extend gratitude and thanks to the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, whose unceded and unsurrendered territory we are privileged to come together on this evening. As we reflect on the global hunger crisis, I am reminded of the legacy of colonialism, which has inflicted hunger on so many Indigenous people across Turtle Island and across the world. J'ai le privilège de diriger Coopération Canada, une coalition de plus de 90 organisations canadiennes de développement international et d'aide humanitaire, travaillant dans toutes les régions du monde. En tant que voix nationale indépendante pour la coopération internationale, à Coopération Canada, nous travaillons avec nos membres et d'autres partenaires au Canada et dans le monde afin de nous réunir, de collaborer et de plaider en faveur d'un monde plus juste, plus sûr et plus durable. La crise mondiale de la faim est au cœur des activités de nombreuses organisations canadiennes de développement international et d'aide humanitaire. Travaillant en étroite collaboration avec des partenaires dans les zones critiques où il y a l'insécurité alimentaire, ces organisations canadiennes œuvrent pour soutenir les communautés au précipice de la faim et plaident pour des politiques et des investissements afin de s'attaquer à la crise mondiale de la faim à laquelle nous sommes confrontés. Je suis très fière du travail que ces organisations canadiennes accomplissent dans le monde entier. We are thrilled to be partnering with the Walrus this evening to facilitate this really important conversation on the impact of the global hunger crisis on communities in Canada and around the world, and what we can do to address it. I would like to thank the Canadian Food Grains Bank, World Vision Canada, and the World Food Programme for their support of this Walrus Talks tonight. It is only through collective action that we can address the world's most pressing problems. Our partnership to bring you this Walrus Talks is really testament to that. Many thanks again for being here, and I really look forward to the engaging conversation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Global hunger. This is underreported. It's definitely not something I'm hearing people talk about day to day. For those of you in the sector, it may be different, but this is something we need to be talking about day to day. If you take a look back, global hunger actually steadily declined for about 50 years. But in 2015, things started to change and it reversed. It now affects 1 out of 10 people globally. Take a look in this room. You can easily count 10 people. I can do it right now. 1 in 10. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this. The global supply chains, the climate crisis, conflict, rising prices. We're here to talk about it, to find out what can be done about it. Specifically, that collective action, what can we in our communities do about it? Tonight, we'll hear from 7 people, all leaders in their fields, about how we can better address the global hunger crisis, both here in Canada and around the world. A bit about the Walrus Talks and how it works. 7 speakers, 7 minutes each, 7 different perspectives. And these talks go back to back and are followed by a reception, which you're all invited to because that's where the conversation comes to life. 2 of tonight's speakers will be giving their talks in French, en français. So if you picked up a headset on the way in, I see some of you have, you can put it on to hear our 3rd and our 7th speaker. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Deputy Regional Director, Latin America and the Caribbean, World Food Programme, Kyung-nan Park. Country Representative, Ethiopia, Lutheran World Federation, Sophie Gebreyes. President, UPA Development International, Interim President of Agricord, President, Coalition Nourrir l'Humanité Développement, Marcel Groleau, Executive Director, Qajuqturvik Community Food Center, Blais, Chair, Food Secure Canada, Melana Roberts, Chief Executive Officer, Daily Bread Food Bank, Neil Hetherington, and Country Representative, Canada, Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, Jean-Charles Le Vallée. Thank you all for joining us.
Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. My name is Kyung-nan Park, and I'm the Deputy Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United Nations World Food Program. As a South Korean, working at the World Food Program has special meaning for me, as my country was one of the countries to have received humanitarian assistance many years ago. And after having spent my career over the decades in nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, I have never seen what we are experiencing now, a global food crisis of unprecedented proportions. In a world of plenty, where enough food is produced to feed everyone, hunger should be a thing of the past. Today, there are as many as 828 million people that go to bed hungry every night, of which 345 million people suffer from hunger at a crisis level, almost triple the number in 2019. And a total of 50 million people in 45 countries are teetering on the edge of famine. The global hunger crisis has not yet reached its peak. In 2023, will be worse unless we get ahead of the situation. This crisis is about affordability, not availability. What does that mean? There is enough of everything, but at the wrong price and in the wrong place. Rising food and fuel prices and falling living standards have created a wave of collateral hunger, with millions unable to afford a basic meal. How does this affect the Americas? The food, fuel, and economic crises precipitated by the Ukraine conflict, on top of the impact of crisis extremes and the COVID-19 pandemic, have deeply affected the region and have left more than 10 million people facing hunger in countries where WFP operates in the region, up from 3.5 million in 2019. In the region, there are three main drivers. First, climate change. Every region of the world is affected by climate change. Climate shocks kill crops and livestock, degrade soils, deplete fisheries, damage infrastructure and agricultural assets, let alone the impact on human lives. This reduces food supplies, causing prices to rise. The effects of climate shocks are particularly evident in the Caribbean and in Central America, where people are severely affected by intermittent droughts, hurricanes, and La Niña. This year alone, the region has already been hit by hurricanes Fiona, Ian, and Julia. Second, migration. We have the second largest migration crisis in the world. Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru combined host approximately 4.5 million out of nearly 6 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants in the region, with half of them not being able to afford 3 meals a day or safe and dignified housing. The migration crisis is hemispheric, as new migration routes have opened linking South and Central America through the Darien Gap in Panama, now the most perilous migration journey worldwide, and onwards to North America. Third, conflict. As the biggest driver of hunger, currently 60% of the world's hungry live in areas afflicted by violence. WFP provides relief to exhausted populations and uses food assistance to build pathways to peace and stability, work for which WFP was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. Haiti is an example of WFP's work in one country in the region that is affected by these three drivers. Haiti plunged into an acute crisis over the past 3 months, where 1 in 2 people are facing hunger. Insecurity in the country and increased gang violence is impacting road access, preventing fuel and critical supplies, and currently hampers humanitarian and development activities. Vulnerable residents have lost access to drinking water, food, education, and health services, and a rise in cholera is worsening an already complex situation. Amidst multiple security challenges, WFP is committed to stay and deliver with our partners, especially NGOs on the ground, with the aim to assist up to 1.7 million people by the end of this year, with food assistance, as well as providing the humanitarian community with safe and reliable means of transport to reach the vulnerable populations through our United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. Now, what can we all do together? Regional stability in Latin America and the Caribbean, part of our shared region of the Americas, is critical. A coordinated effort, together with governments, private sector, and civil society actors, is the only way to mitigate an even more severe crisis in 2023. Together, we need to invest in people, communities, and countries to help them better withstand future shocks so they are able to prosper. I would like to mention one key ingredient. We cannot talk about global food crisis without an understanding that zero hunger cannot be achieved without gender equality. In nearly 2/3 of the world, women are more likely than men to go hungry, despite producing 60 to 80% of food in most developing countries. Furthermore, the child of a pregnant woman who self-identifies as indigenous or Afro-descended is 62% more likely to suffer from chronic malnutrition in this region. WFP contributes to the enrollment and retention of girls in schools, recognizing them as powerful agents of change for the future, and the transformative opportunity of girls' education, and also supports economic empowerment of women by helping to increase their decision-making power and financial access. Canada is a very close ally of WFP, including long-withstanding support and commitment to operations in its neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean. In Haiti alone, funding from Canada has ensured 180,000 children receive nutritious meals daily across 950 schools, as well as the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service operations. As we are continuing to witness the Americas, and in fact the globe, are intrinsically linked, inaction in this global hunger crisis is not an option. We need to act now in the face of this unprecedented level of need to save lives, while continuing to invest in sustainable solutions for stability and peace. With all the crises in the world, the issues in this region remain hidden and invisible. We need to work together to raise our voices of concern, as every investment made in the root causes of hunger will give the option for people to stay in their communities and not worry about where their next meal is coming from. Keep giving generously so we can keep saving lives together. My hope is that one day we achieve zero hunger and that everybody has enough to eat. Merci de votre intérêt et votre attention.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophie Gebreyes. I'm the country director of the Lutheran World Federation in Ethiopia. I'm very honored and privileged to be here this evening. I'm here to share my experience in Ethiopia, focusing on hunger and the toxic melange of conflict, climate change, and food insecurity. The humanitarian statistics currently in Ethiopia are staggering. 24 million affected populations, close to 20 million of them needing food assistance. Over 5 million people affected by conflict and climate-induced internal displacement. These are people who do not know where their next meal is coming from. The humanitarian requirements for 2022 for Ethiopia alone stands to close to $2 billion. However, due to competing crises and priorities around the world, most of them are not being reached by humanitarian assistance. How did we get there? As you know, Ethiopia was almost synonymous with famine, especially in the 1970s and in the 1980s, with newsreels of biblical famines moving people and governments to donate money and food aid. Canada was a huge food aid donor, so much so that one aid worker in Addis Ababa years ago reacted to yet another impending drought by saying, as long as it rains in Canada. You know, history has a way of repeating itself. When the Lutheran World Federation responded to the emergency in Tigray in northern Ethiopia some 40 years ago, the situation was eerily the same as now. A severe drought, exacerbated by a violent conflict between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, in the north, and the central government, created a highly complex humanitarian crisis that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions, ultimately becoming the catalyst for regime change. Then the rebel group took power in 1991 and ran the country for the next almost 30 years with an iron fist. In the next couple of decades that followed, and with the relative peace, Ethiopia achieved most of the Health Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. These health gains could not have been realized without progress in other MDGs: poverty reduction, education, access to safe drinking water, and peace and stability in the country. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, Ethiopia made significant progress in achieving the MDG target for reducing hunger by half between 1990 and 2015. The prevalence of undernourishment declined by 57.2%, and the absolute number of undernourished people declined by 12%. Gains in agricultural productivity, the flagship productive safety program, safety net program, and increases in labor productivity are thought to be the main drivers for the progress. At the macroeconomic level, since 2004, Ethiopian economy recorded a high growth rate averaging 10.9% annually over an 11-year period. So what went wrong? The growth, the slashing of poverty levels I just talked about, began to decline after 2016 with the proliferation of conflicts starting in 2017. Since 2017, Ethiopia has been confronted with multiple intercommunal conflicts, causing loss of lives and massive internal displacements. In 2018 and again in 2021, Ethiopia earned the unenviable accolade of the country with the highest number of internally displaced people in the world. By the end of 2020, the devastating conflict in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, erupted, the specter from 40 years ago revisiting the country, pitting the federal government against the same TPLF, which after 30 years in power was relegated to a provincial power that did not sit well with it. While violent conflict remains the main driver of hunger in Ethiopia currently, it is exacerbated by climate change, economic slowdown, and high inflation. Despite having contributed very little to historical greenhouse gas emissions, it is severely affected by the effects of climate change. Droughts and floods have become more frequent, more intense, and increasingly unpredictable. Ethiopia's economy is mostly agriculture-led, with 80% of its population living in rural areas, but the agriculture remains subsistence and rain-fed, which makes it extremely vulnerable to weather variability. In many cases, and in Ethiopia par excellence, the consequences of violent conflict, the effects of climate change, have conspired to create a perfect storm and weaken people's and communities' ability to withstand extreme shocks. At the macro level, high inflation due to the rapid depreciation of the Ethiopian currency, people's purchasing power has plummeted dramatically. In September, the inflation declined to 30.7%. I said declined. Food inflation is also high at 35.5% due to the recent increases in cooking oil, bread, cereal, and meat product prices. Ethiopia is a net importer of food and among the largest wheat importer in sub-Saharan Africa, importing over 30% of its domestic requirement, of which about a quarter is for food assistance. Despite the war raging in distant Ukraine, the economic consequences began to be felt in Ethiopia almost immediately. Ethiopia relies heavily on wheat imports from Ukraine, from Russia, and from the United States. The government of Ethiopia purchases all wheat imports except that for food distribution. So what is the way forward? It is clear that without achieving food security, it would be difficult to build sustainable peace. However, the reverse is true as well. Without peace, it is difficult to achieve food security. Conflict, food insecurity, displacement, climate change, structural poverty, and inequality require a bold and transformative action to achieve peace dividends. We need to up our ambition to tackle climate change and build resilience in our communities. North-South solidarity is needed, as rich countries are responsible for much of the historical greenhouse gas emissions to support low-income countries adapt to climate change through adaptation and mitigation efforts. Policy coherence is needed when calling for peace. Much of the states selling arms and benefiting from wars are members of the United Nations Security Council and G7 countries. The United Nations resolutions and call for peace are beginning to sound hollow. Food systems in conflict-affected countries are often characterized by a high level of informality, structural weakness, and vulnerability. We need good governance, strong institutions, and structures to promote accountability both in conflict and peace times. In the meantime, it is imperative that the humanitarian assistance is commensurate to the level of requirements in order to save lives. I thank you.
Bonjour, mon nom est Marcel Groleau. Alors, comme je parle français, j'ai 2 minutes de plus que les autres. Alors, la crise, j'ai intitulé mon texte « La crise de l'insécurité alimentaire ». Je suis né en 1959 dans une famille agricole du Québec, 7e de 11 enfants. Coïncidence, mon père a acheté son premier tracteur l'année de ma naissance. Jeune, j'ai donc connu le travail au champ avec les chevaux. Vivre sur la ferme n'avait rien de bucolique. C'était la pauvreté et c'était difficile. Les choses ont changé dans les années 70 grâce à l'action collective des producteurs et des syndicats agricoles. En travaillant collectivement, localement ou mondialement, on peut changer les choses. L'organisation de la mise en marché collective et les programmes d'assurance agricole sont à l'origine de l'essor de l'agriculture au Canada et de plusieurs pays. Durant les années 70, la mécanisation, la science et la technologie ont fait faire des gains de productivité incroyables à l'agriculture. Aujourd'hui, autre époque, la robotisation et la génomique ont pris le relais. Sur notre ferme, 4 robots font maintenant la traite des vaches. Ces gains de productivité ont permis de répondre à la croissance de la demande alimentaire mondiale et même plus. Nous étions 3 milliards en 1960 et nous sommes maintenant près de 8 milliards. Nous nourrissons 5 milliards de personnes de plus qu'en 1960 avec une diète plus riche. Les problèmes d'obésité en témoignent. Cette réussite est phénoménale. Nous produisons suffisamment de nourriture pour alimenter tous et chacun sur la planète, au point que depuis les années 80, pour écouler les surplus de production et soutenir les prix à la ferme, les gouvernements occidentaux, l'Europe et les États-Unis en tête, investissent des milliards en soutien et subventions. Les dépenses alimentaires en fonction du revenu des ménages ont continuellement diminué jusqu'à tout récemment. Un gain social énorme. Au Canada, par exemple, la famille moyenne dépense à peine plus de 11 % de ses revenus pour s'alimenter, alors qu'en Afrique de l'Ouest, par contre, c'est 50 %. La faim dans le monde est d'abord un problème de pauvreté et de partage de la richesse. Cependant, l'augmentation de la productivité agricole que nous avons connue depuis 50 ans s'essouffle. En 2022, nous sommes à un point d'équilibre ou presque. L'offre ne surpasse plus la demande comme par le passé pour les principales denrées. Les marchés sont inquiets. Les prix des marchés à terme à la bourse de Chicago sont à la hausse. La spéculation fait son œuvre. Sur la bourse, on transige sur les prix et conditions de marché à venir, et l'avenir est moins prévisible. En fait, plusieurs indicateurs et facteurs se conjuguent présentement et les perspectives futures sont plus incertaines. Premièrement, et ça a été dit, le climat. Les sécheresses et les inondations ont été nombreuses dans le monde. En 2021, les prairies canadiennes ont vécu l'une des pires sécheresses de leur histoire. Le Canada étant parmi les 6 principaux pays exportateurs de denrées agricoles, cela a inquiété les marchés. Durant la même année, les conditions ont été difficiles au Brésil et en Argentine. Alors, avant même l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie, les prix du maïs, du blé et du soja atteignaient des records. Nous assistons également à un redéploiement du cadre géopolitique mondial. Le repositionnement politique de la Chine et l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie en février ont redéfini les canaux de commercialisation mondiaux de plusieurs produits, notamment en matière énergétique. Les États-Unis veulent s'affranchir de la Chine. Le gaz naturel de la Russie ne se rend plus en Europe. Hausse sans précédent des coûts de l'énergie, l'Europe étant un important exportateur de denrées agricoles, les coûts élevés de l'énergie auront une incidence importante sur la filière alimentaire. À moyen terme, la décarbonation de l'économie, qui devrait nous mener à la carboneutralité en 2050, aura sans doute un effet sur le prix des aliments. Des mesures plus concrètes commencent à s'appliquer, taxes sur le carbone et autres. La plupart des pays ont du rattrapage à faire pour atteindre leur cible de 2035. À plus long terme, mais peut-être plus tôt qu'on ne le pense, l'accès à l'eau pour l'irrigation des cultures sera plus difficile. De grandes réserves d'eau, ici en Amérique et en Europe, sont très basses. On a surexploité les nappes phréatiques, des choix difficiles vont s'imposer. La surpêche et l'état des réserves halieutiques est inquiétante. Le réchauffement des eaux menace également ces réserves qui alimentent aujourd'hui des centaines de millions de personnes. Ils devront se tourner vers d'autres sources alimentaires. La montée des eaux et le déplacement de population va également entraîner une perte de terres arables. Les nouvelles mesures environnementales ont aussi un effet sur la productivité et les coûts de production en agriculture. Le bannissement de certains pesticides pour lesquels il n'existe pas de solution de remplacement et la réduction de la fertilisation azotée vont entraîner une modification des plans de culture. La transition écologique est soutenue par des programmes dans plusieurs pays, mais cela ne couvre qu'une partie des frais. À titre d'exemple, le Canada veut réduire de 40 % la fertilisation azotée. C'est énorme et personne ne sait vraiment quel impact cela aura sur la productivité. Comprenez-moi bien, je ne suis pas contre ces mesures, mais elles mettront de la pression sur les marchés. Un autre phénomène est la concentration du secteur de la fourniture des services et des intrants. La fourniture des intrants, semences, fertilisants et équipements pour la production agricole est concentrée entre les mains de quelques grandes multinationales. Depuis quelques années, nous assistons à une augmentation sans précédent des prix des intrants, et cela avait commencé bien avant l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie. Donc, les risques que nous soyons dans un marché alimentaire inflationniste pour les prochaines années est bien réel, d'autant plus que la demande alimentaire va augmenter avec la croissance de la population mondiale. Les marchés agricoles sont très fragiles et ils répondent la plupart du temps de façon exagérée aux risques et à l'incertitude. C'est la nature même du marché qui est en cause. On doit manger et la substitution vers une autre denrée est rarement possible. Donc, au moindre indice de rareté appréhendé, les prix des denrées alimentaires explosent et inversement, s'il y a des surplus, les prix s'effondrent. Je ne crois pas que nous soyons actuellement face à une réelle crise alimentaire. Il y a suffisamment de nourriture disponible. Nous sommes dans un contexte inflationniste qui met à mal les moins nantis de la planète. Chez nous, la demande aux banques alimentaires a augmenté de 30 %. Dans les pays moins bien nantis, l'inflation frappe encore plus fort. Alors, les conséquences sur la population sont encore plus grandes. De plus en plus de gens sur la planète peinent à se nourrir, pas tant à cause de la rareté des aliments que de l'inflation provoquée essentiellement par l'incertitude, la hausse des coûts de l'énergie et la spéculation. Il est aberrant que l'alimentation, dont dépend la vie de milliards de personnes, soit entre les mains bienveillantes et invisibles du marché. Il est aberrant que nous n'ayons que des estimations sur les stocks mondiaux de céréales, qui sont à la base de l'alimentation humaine. De simples rumeurs surgissent sur les stocks en Chine et les marchés réagissent. Il est aberrant que les ensemencements mondiaux ne soient pas davantage planifiés. Tous les producteurs individuellement sur la planète prennent leurs décisions seuls en fonction de ce que sera, selon eux, le marché mondial l'an prochain. Les gouvernements ne possèdent pas de réserves stratégiques des principales denrées alimentaires. Ces réserves d'État pourraient limiter la spéculation et stabiliser les prix. Ces outils existent dans le secteur de l'énergie. Des actions concrètes et concertées pour donner à tous un accès à des aliments de qualité et en quantité suffisante sont possibles. Et le point de bascule entre l'offre et la demande alimentaire sur lequel nous sommes en ce moment est une opportunité pour réfléchir à de nouveaux mécanismes de stabilisation des marchés et de l'approvisionnement alimentaire mondial. Ce serait à la fois au bénéfice des consommateurs et des producteurs. Comme mentionné, je suis président de la coalition Nourrir l'humanité durablement. Nourrir durablement, c'est un accès à tous à des aliments de qualité, produits dans le respect de l'environnement et de la protection de la biodiversité, et en respect de la préservation des ressources naturelles que sont les terres arables et l'eau. Un rôle accru des institutions internationales sera nécessaire pour relever ce défi. Un rééquilibrage entre les forces du marché et les forces visant à protéger les droits humains, l'environnement et la biodiversité sont nécessaires. Le droit international est sans doute le meilleur outil pour y parvenir. Nourrir l'humanité durablement est la première étape pour relever les défis planétaires que sont les changements climatiques et la protection de l'environnement. Il n'y a pas de paix sociale possible si un peuple est affamé. Le réchauffement climatique, la protection de l'environnement et de la biodiversité sont bien secondaires quand la famille et les enfants sont affamés. Nourrir l'humanité durablement n'est pas un défi, c'est une obligation pour un monde en paix et l'avenir des générations futures. Merci.
Unukut, good evening. My name is Rachel Blais, and I'm the Executive Director of Qajuqturvik Community Food Center in Iqaluit, Nunavut. Food insecurity among Inuit in Canada has been called one of the longest-lasting public health emergencies in Canadian history. 3 in 4 adult Inuit in Nunavut are food insecure. As food insecurity continues to increase, it is clear that current strategies are failing. They are failing because food security in the North cannot exist without food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right to culturally appropriate food harvested through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. Food sovereignty in Inuit Nunangat can only be met when Inuit have control over their own food system. The path to achieving a food sovereign system has been researched, recorded, and delivered to our governments by Inuit leadership in recent years. It has also been identified as a key step towards reconciliation. Food sovereignty asserts that people have a right to local food. Despite the myth that the Canadian Arctic is a barren food desert, there is, in fact, a vibrant local food system in the North that could be used to address this crisis. In Nunavut, locally sourced food is country food, and food producers are Inuit hunters. Country food comes from the land and sea and includes Arctic char, seal, muskox, caribou, whale, walrus, clams, berries, to name just a few. Country foods are extremely nutritious and widely preferred to store-bought foods. Prior to colonization, Inuit moved with the seasons, ensuring that a steady source of country food was always available. Acting as environmental stewards, hunters protected the land and waters to ensure the survival of their communities. With their communities now facing the highest levels of food insecurity in the country, hunters are the frontline workers keeping people fed through the use of sharing networks. Beginning in the mid-1900s, colonial powers attempted to destroy Nunavut's food system. A series of federal policies disconnected Inuit from the land and altered their way of life. As a result of these policies and the culling of their sled dogs, hunters had to purchase snowmobiles and gas if they wanted to hunt and feed their families. To be able to purchase these items, hunters were forced to participate in the wage economy, further disconnecting them from the land. Prior to these colonial policies, prolonged periods of food scarcity among Inuit were extremely rare. Today, hunting is very expensive, and many hunters have to subsidize the activity by working a 9-to-5. This limits the amount of time hunters can spend out on the land and the freedom to harvest when the weather and movements of animals are right. As hunting becomes more expensive and more hunters are forced to participate in the wage economy, hunting is declining in Nunavut. As a result, there is less country food distributed through sharing networks and more people relying on store-bought food. Most perishable foods imported into Nunavut are eligible for a subsidy through the federal government's Nutrition North program. Northern retailers receive a subsidy meant to offset the transportation costs of eligible food and other essential items. In theory, these savings are meant to be passed on to the consumer. To this day, country foods are not eligible for the subsidy. In 2011, the year that Nutrition North was introduced, food insecurity rates in Nunavut increased by 6% and have continued to rise ever since. Country food is making up less of people's diets than even a few decades ago. At the same time, there is a wide income gap between Inuit and non-Inuit in the territory, and a cost of living that is 2 to 3 times the national average. This means that many Nunavummiut cannot afford store-bought food, even after it's been subsidized. To achieve food sovereignty, we must move away from policies that only seek to address food security. Food insecurity in Nunavut was created by colonial powers, and current policies have only seemed to perpetuate the issue. To achieve food sovereignty, we must make sure that Inuit have a say in all decisions affecting their land and food system. We must listen, and we must act. Inuit organizations have identified that substantial investments in infrastructure are urgently needed. For example, Nunavut has very little marine infrastructure, despite the fact that so much country food can be found in the sea. The entire territory has 1 small craft harbor. In comparison, Saskatchewan has 12. We must also create new policies that directly support hunters. Hunters should be paid fairly for the vital work that they provide. Just like anywhere else in the country, food insecurity is not a food problem, it's an income problem. Ultimately, the key food producers in the most food insecure region in the country should not have to live in poverty in order to provide their communities with food. Food insecurity in Nunavut is only continuing to worsen, showing that the status quo doesn't work. Neither food security or food sovereignty will be reached by continuing to focus on costly imported food while ignoring the local food system that is right there in front of us. Canada is one of the most food-wealthy nations in the world, and that includes the abundance of country food. We must meaningfully address food insecurity in the North by first listening to the recommendations that Inuit have put forward. We must dispel the myth that the Canadian Arctic is a barren food desert, and support a vibrant local food system that is key to achieving food sovereignty in Nunavut. Kuyanami, thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to start off by asking all of you to close your eyes and think back to March 2020. Remember the feeling you felt after waiting in line, waiting to go to the grocery store, with anticipation, and then you were met with an empty shelf. The feeling in the pit of your stomach when you knew the things you needed most were not on the shelves. By a show of hands, how many of you remember that? Wow, that's almost everyone in the room. Now, the reality is, if we don't make some serious changes and start considering our supply chains, this feeling may be less of a distant memory and more of a glimpse into the future. My name is Melana Roberts, and I'm a food justice advocate, food policy strategist, and chair of Food Secure Canada. And I'm here to talk to you about why strengthening our domestic food supply chain is an essential part of combating the rise of food insecurity and building resilience in Canada's food system. Now, in Canada, we have a dynamic food system. The agricultural sector is one of our strongest economic drivers. And in fact, we're one of the few countries in the world that has the capacity to be entirely self-sufficient, producing all of the food to feed Canadians in this country, although we currently don't. Canada is the world's 5th largest exporter and importer of agri-food. We have more than 2 million jobs in agriculture, composing 12% of all employment in the country. And it generates about $114 billion in the annual GDP. So when you think about it, economically, food in Canada sounds pretty good. But in 2021, it didn't sound so good for many Canadians. More than 5.8 million Canadians reported being food insecure due to lack of household income. That includes 1.4 million children and a disproportionate amount of Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. Now, this situation is widely recognized as being driven by inadequate access to income to purchase food and cover the cost of staples like housing and childcare. And despite the fact that the vast majority of food insecure folks are working, with 60% of them being employed. Now, in 2019, Canada launched its first ever food policy, providing an overarching policy direction on food priorities, including food insecurity. And although it didn't include solutions that responded to the crux of this challenge by doing things like increasing the Child Care Canada benefit, in 2021, Trudeau did something important. He spelled out a distinct focus on his local supply chains in his agricultural mandate letter. He shifted what was an export-focused policy to one that now has levers to tackle an overlooked and increasing food security issue, building Canada's resilience against food shortages. Now, we live in a hyper-connected world where food connects us across place, culture, beliefs, transporting us to Mexico, Ethiopia, Shanghai, all in a day through the global corporate food system, replete with imports, exports, and food shipments across oceans and continents just to get the food from the field to our plates. But this increasing globalization and commercialization of food, which simply means the production of food for crops in the market rather than self-consumption, has resulted in a growing instability in our food supply chains. In order to compete, farmers are forced to adopt more industrialized models of specialization and mass production, covering rising costs of inputs and to compete with cheap agricultural labor overseas. The situation has severely limited the diversity of crops that are grown in Canada and has altered the scale of production in order to meet the rising costs of imports and compete with cheap agricultural abroad. Now, rural livelihoods are also deeply impacted by this reality, as they're threatened by cheap imports, undercutting local farmers by placing increased control over food systems in the hands of few corporations. The result of these cheap food policies is that new generations of farmers are deterred from staying on the farm or getting into farming altogether. We've seen a 70% decline in the new farmers joining agriculture since 1991. And an aging workforce of farmers at the average age of 55 who are expected to retire in the next 8 years. So despite producing in excess of grains, oils, meats, and dairy, over time, Canada has become more reliant on its food from other countries and produces about 19% of its domestically consumed fruit and only 67% of its vegetables. Now, our resilience on off-season crops from countries across the world also has environmental and social impacts, as this practice displaces local farms from more fertile land and takes land out of production for local markets. As subsistence farms are lost to export producers, local food insecurity is jeopardized for the purpose of cash cropping. So what does all of this have to do with food security in Canada? How will this information help us think about how we move forward? Well, as some of my other speakers alluded to, what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine the world's food basket, producing more than a quarter of the world's barley and wheat combined, and a provider of essential farming inputs like nitrogen and potash. These are serious issues. So when farmers in this region suddenly became soldiers to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's naturally spouted concerns about the rises and the risk of food supply concentrated in a handful of distant countries. Coupled with 2 preceding years of unprecedented pandemic-produced shocks, stressed supply chains saw FAO food price index staples like vegetable oil increase 182% and 68% in cereals. This begs the question, if the war in Ukraine is causing famine and food insecurity in distant places like Egypt and Nigeria, is the current industrial food system really working? These crises show that we have over-optimized efficiency, relying on concentrated food centers and production. The combined effects of COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have exposed the fragility of supply chains and their severe impacts on global food security. Finding ways to diversify and integrate domestic food and value chains and increase local consumption will be an important first step forward, building up resilience to these shocks. Now, current food policies have made it harder for Canadian farmers to sell to someone who's living in a neighboring province than someone living in Philadelphia or even in Mexico. And I want to talk about 3 actions we can think about to help realize stronger local food supply and access here in Canada. The first is removing barriers to interprovincial trade. So for decades, Canada's interprovincial trade has been mirrored in inconsistencies. For example, I can be in PEI, I can go into the liquor store, and I can find liquor from Australia, from South Africa, but I can't buy alcohol produced in Nova Scotia. Or rules that have a truck that must stop and change its tires between certain provinces because of inconsistent tire regulations on the sizes that can be driven on the road. Or similarly, trucking configurations are only allowed in British Columbia roads in the night and Alberta roads in the day, forcing drivers to spend several hours to be able to move from one province to the next. These changes limit small, innovative shifts in our food system that can not only support more domestic access to food availability, but also have benefits economically. Something small like changing 10% of Ontario's imports for locally grown produce could have an impact of $250 million additional dollars to the GDP and the creation of 3,400 new jobs. A focus on local procurement can also support immediate food insecurity responses. For example, during the pandemic, the federal government invested $200 million in federal emergency food relief during COVID-19 and could have procured thousands of pounds of fresh produce from local farmers to save tons of food that would have gone to waste while also addressing food insecurity. There are also multiplier effects to consider about these changes, benefiting the environment and social outcomes. By having these shifts, we would see a limited distance for food to travel, reducing fuel and CO2 emissions, as well as food waste, because food would have a limited time for moving from the farm to our plates. There's also opportunities to increase social trust and information flows with greater credibility and traceability about where our food is coming from and the conditions under which it's produced. More than that, I think we can all agree, fresher food tastes better. Am I right? So it can also result in more local jobs, rural jobs, and money staying in our Canadian markets, reinforcing rural trade and commerce and linkages between rural and urban centers, an area we see increasingly being polarized in the Canadian context. Number 2, building on processing centers. So recently, during the pandemic, the federal government launched a local infrastructure fund, which is great, but we need a more robust, large-scale responses to ensure that we have distribution we need. Canada is known for quality agricultural products. However, due to a lack of regional processing and distribution facilities, we only process half of raw products before sale and don't have an adequate network of facilities to share and transport goods, forfeiting a huge amount of potential profit. Just think about selling apple cider instead of apples, or having bread instead of just selling the wheat, or even cranberry juice instead of just the cranberries. There's a lot of opportunity here. We just need the investment. Number 3, domestic farming incentives. How will we ensure local production remains affordable and the transition toward domestic production doesn't move those costs onto the consumer or onto the farmers themselves. This is a key question we need to ask ourselves. By identifying incentives and reallocating subsidies to support domestic and sustainable production are definitely approaches we need to consider. All of this is great, but the truth of the matter is the price of doing nothing is the greatest cost of all, because it means that empty grocery store shelf of 2020 will no longer be a distant memory, but a new reality. A future filled with frequent food shocks that perpetuate hunger in Canada and abroad. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. You've heard many different ideas from my colleagues on the stage. There's no app, no algorithm, no farming technique, no silver bullet to address the challenge of global hunger, or food shortages for that matter. But tonight, we can all be part of an important narrative shift, calling for a whole-of-systems approach. We need to start by integrating our local food systems and building good policy to facilitate those changes, alongside critical responses to target many Indigenous, Black, and low-income people living on the front lines of food issues. To me, this is the first step toward realizing true food system transformation, moving towards food sovereignty, realizing a right to food, and building a more resilient and healthy food system for all. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Neil Hetherington. I have the awesome privilege of being the CEO of the Daily Bread Food Bank. Sharing a stage with these speakers and being in front of the elite Walrus audience is certainly testing my nerves tonight, and I'm deeply regretting my spicy garlic chicken shawarma I had for lunch today. Despite my nervousness with the address, I want to come to this podium with a sense of hope. Hope that tonight we can think more about the individuals in Canada who are experiencing food insecurity, the 5.8 million Canadians, and begin to look at the reality that there are solutions ahead. I represent the Daily Bread Food Bank, which provides food for about 200 food programs in the city of Toronto. And we are there because we fundamentally believe that everybody has a right to food. I'm going to speak first in a sort of global context and then bring it home into a Toronto arena and then speak from a personal experience. The Economist recently published its 11th edition of the Global Food Security Index. The index reviews food security among 120 countries and ranks them based on affordability, safety, sustainability, and affordability. And we do all right in Canada. We rank 7 out of 120 countries. Canada owns the podium when it comes to food safety, ranking number 1. But never content with the status quo, what's keeping us from being on the podium in the other categories? And the answer to that is food affordability. Incomes in our country are not adequate nor keeping pace with the cost of food, housing, and other basics. And in this one category, Canada drops to 26, falling behind Qatar and Japan and Australia and 22 other nations. Of course, there are ways that we can combat food affordability. For example, as a nation, we are disastrous when it comes to wasting food. According to Second Harvest, we waste $50 billion worth of food each year in this country. But maybe our food is too expensive because labor is too expensive. And I would say the answer to that is absolutely not. 8 of the 10 worst paying jobs in our economy are within the food sector. There is a lack of justice when it comes to our foreign worker program, and fundamentally, we know that behind every cheap price is cheapened labor. So instead of just looking at how we can drive down costs on the supply side of things, I'd like to take a different approach to the problem. 7 minutes doesn't mean I get a lot of time to talk about policy, but I will say that there are 3 categories that we at the Daily Bread advocate for on a daily basis, and that is the development and preservation of decent, affordable housing, the movement away from precarious employment, and finally, decent income supports for those, particularly those on disability. So on the local level, and what we've been experiencing in Toronto, I'm going to bring you back a few years. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing 60,000 clients per month at the food bank. When the pandemic hit, that number doubled, and 120,000 client visits were recorded every single month during that difficult time because there was a lack of resiliency to that acute economic shock. Before I tell you the third chapter of the growth in client visits, I want to pause for a second and just remind you, just as we heard closing our eyes, and remind you of that time just after the lockdown, when we were all coming together and we were clanging pots and rallying our essential workers. And we had this sense of righteous indignation when we were all shocked by how quickly the lineups outside of food banks were. And everybody, and I'm sure everybody in this room, was saying, we cannot have this happen again. Indeed, we need to build back better. Those lineups outside of food banks were a wake-up call for our country. But it's not a wake-up call if we simply go back to sleep. And we did go back to sleep. We let all 3 levels of government press the snooze button. We did not and have not built back better. So here's the third chapter in that brief history of the Daily Bread Food Bank and our client visits. The third chapter opens up in January of this year, where we were serving 120,000, and then a new shock to the system, inflation, and that number skyrocketed to 186,000 visits this past month, precisely because we made the choice not to act and make systemic changes to housing, income, and employment. And finally, I want to talk about the face of those who are food insecure. And I'm going to talk about my friend Bobby. Bobby and I have been friends for 35 years. He has serious health challenges, which limits his ability to drive the majority of his income from employment. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about his income. You know, in a Walrus talk, you're not allowed a PowerPoint, and so I'm going to do the next best thing. Bobby is allowed to spend $521 in Ontario on housing. And for everything else, he's given an additional $705. That means he gets a total, this is the PowerPoint, nonprofit style, he gets a total of $1,227. Now, the average rent in Toronto for a bachelor apartment is $1,225. Food for one person is $320, and a discounted bus pass is $112. So that means his total expenses are $1,657. He has a monthly deficit every single month of $430.52. And that makes the assumption, the ridiculous assumption, that he's not going to buy clothes, no entertainment, no television, no internet, no cell phone, no utilities. The poverty line in Toronto is about $2,200 per month. And as you can see, in Ontario, we legislate that anybody on disability needs to be and must stay in poverty. And fundamentally, that goes against each of the values that I know we espouse in this room. Daily Bread has taken our policy recommendations, those 3 policy recommendations, and had them tested. Because we knew that there was a problem, we articulated the problem, we knew that there were solutions, we articulated those policy solutions, and then we went to Dr. Kneebone at the University of Calgary and we asked, what would the impact be of each of these policy levers? And what came back was common sense, that if you increase minimum wage by $1 in Ontario, there'll be 187,000 less food bank visits. If you increase Ontario disability by $15 a month, there will be some 275,000 fewer visits across the province. We know the problem, we know the policy, we know the impact that it can have. And so now everybody in this room and everybody online has an opportunity and has a choice to make. And that fundamental choice is we can be content that there are 5.8 million Canadians who are food insecure. We can be content that the Daily Bread Food Bank is going to continue to serve 186,000 clients every single month. We can be content that Bobby is legislated to live in poverty. Or we can be a collective voice for good and remind each level of government of their poverty reduction strategies and call on them to implement them. So I'm going to finish with a very simple question. I'd ask that everybody in this room raise your hand if you are not going to advocate for change. Well, it's unanimous, so thank you very, very much.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Je m'appelle Jean-Charles Vallée. Je suis le représentant canadien pour ICA. ICA, c'est l'Institut interaméricain pour la coopération en agriculture au Costa Rica. On fait partie du système interaméricain. C'est un peu comme parallèle au système des Nations unies, mais c'est que les Amériques. Et on est en fait plus vieux. On a été établi en 1942, donc on a 80 ans. Et au Canada, c'est notre 50e anniversaire cette année. Donc, je suis ici. J'avais une idée de préparer des mots, mais en fait, basé sur ce que j'ai écouté, j'aimerais quand même parler des statistiques qu'on voit là sur l'écran et de ce que vous avez entendu ce soir. Parce que c'est plus que ça. Ce n'est pas 1 sur 10. Et on le vit de différentes manières. C'est sûr que la PAM, quand ils expliquent qu'il y a 828 millions, c'est sur la disponibilité alimentaire. Donc, sur 8 milliards à peu près dans la planète, oui, 1 sur 10 à peu près, disons. Mais dans le monde, la plupart de ces 828 millions, ce qui arrive, c'est que c'est 2 tiers des crises, des conflits. Si on a de la paix dans le monde, on vient de réduire de 3/4 pratiquement le problème d'insécurité alimentaire dans le monde. La pauvreté, c'est pas mal le reste. C'est ce qu'on vit ici au Canada. C'est la raison principale pourquoi les gens vivent d'une insécurité alimentaire. Mais il y a tellement de façons de vivre une insécurité. Oui, il y a la faim dans le monde. Ça, c'est vraiment les 300 millions dont parle la PAM. Ça, c'est des gens qu'on veut aller sauver de manière thérapeutique supplémentaire. On veut les garder en vie. C'est pas vivre, là. C'est survivre. Et donc, quand je parle de disponibilité alimentaire, ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que, par exemple, dans les cartes des Nations unies, on regarde le Canada, c'est 0 ici. Il n'y a pas d'insécurité alimentaire parce qu'il y a trop de bouffe. Par jour, au Canada, il y a, disons, 3200, 3400 kilocalories disponibles. On n'a pas besoin de manger ça. Règle générale, pour un adulte, pour une femme, c'est 1800, pour un homme, c'est 2200. Donc, avec le 3400, il y a assez de bouffe au Canada. Donc, on ne devrait pas avoir aucune insécurité alimentaire dans ce pays-ci. Dans les Amériques, c'est à peu près 40% de la population du Mexique jusqu'en Argentine qui vivent d'une insécurité alimentaire. Et ça, c'est constant. Ce n'est pas juste de 2015, là. Ça, c'est tous les jours. Ça, c'était avant COVID, c'était avant 2015. Il y avait une autre crise. Vous vous souvenez de 2008-2009, là? Il y avait la crise aussi, des prix alimentaires, encore. Donc, ce qui préoccupe beaucoup en ce moment mes collègues au Costa Rica puis mes collègues au Brésil, parce qu'on travaille dans 34 pays membres, et on travaille avec les ministres de l'agriculture parce qu'ils siègent tous sur notre conseil d'administration. Puis au Brésil, ils paniquaient un peu parce qu'ils importent entièrement la Biélorussie ou la Russie, leurs intrants. Fait que là, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? 85% des importations de la potasse dans les Amériques vient de l'étranger. Ils sont vulnérables. C'est la même chose au Canada. On est vulnérable. On a vu les problèmes des contraintes durant le COVID dans la chaîne alimentaire. Ça a réveillé le monde. L'inflation actuellement réveille le monde. Mais le 11% dont parle Marcel, même si la bouffe augmente de 10%, ça va de 11 à 12 peut-être, on est capable de payer ça. Règle générale au pays. Avec l'alcool, c'est 16-17%. Les gens sur le bien-être, ça va être beaucoup plus. Mais le coût de la vie, vous avez écouté, c'est 2200 par mois au Toronto. Ça, c'est le revenu annuel pour le producteur au Honduras, pour sa famille. Donc, il faut comprendre, quand on parle de disponibilité alimentaire, c'est une façon de voir le monde. Si on inclut l'accessibilité, vous avez écouté affordability, c'est ce qu'il a dit là. On est 26e là, ou quelque chose comme ça dans le monde. C'est grave, là. Pour un pays du G7, avec nos capacités de pouvoir d'achat. Donc, on peut faire mieux. Et ce n'est pas juste un accès économique. Alors, quand on parle d'accès physique. Quand j'ai vécu ici la crise là, avec les camionneurs, là, parce que je travaille en ville, et puis on avait fermé le stationnement, fait que là, j'ai renvoyé le personnel au bureau parce qu'on menaçait avec les masques. Mais les gens qui habitent là, ils ne pouvaient pas sortir là. Ils vivaient soudainement d'une insécurité alimentaire. J'habite Gatineau, on a eu des inondations, des gens qui ont 6 pieds d'eau dans le sous-sol. Soudainement, des gens qui sont archi bien payés là, au fédéral, ils vivent d'une insécurité alimentaire. Donc, la malnutrition, souvent on appelle ça aussi la faim cachée. Le Lancet, ils ont publié la semaine passée une publication qui disait qu'une personne sur 2 vit de l'insécurité alimentaire. C'est une autre façon de voir le monde. Si on inclut le zinc, le fer, l'iode, vitamine A, etc., il y en a 29 macronutriments, micronutriments. Pratiquement toute la planète va vivre d'une insécurité alimentaire. Au Canada, vitamine D, c'est à peu près 10 de la population, l'anémie aussi. Donc, il y a moyen de solutionner ça. Les gens qui sont bébés ou les gens en de 50 ans, vitamine D tous les jours. C'est pas cher, là. L'iode est dans le sel, etc. Il y a des solutions. Il faut être solutionniste. Et j'espère que vous allez l'être aussi. En écoutant ce soir, j'espère que ça va vous inspirer. Il faut agir. Et c'est ce que je dis à mes étudiants. On vit d'une très bonne sécurité alimentaire. On est chanceux de vivre ici. C'est une chance, une loterie démographique. On va vivre cette insécurité-là jusqu'en 2060. Si on accepte les croissances démographiques, la population va commencer à décroître en 2060. Et là, on aura moins de pression de la demande sur le système alimentaire. Mais d'ici ce temps-là, on doit faire notre job. On doit être plus responsable. On parle beaucoup d'être plus intelligent, mais moi, j'aimerais être plus responsable et il faut qu'on soit solutionniste. Le Canada est le plus gros gaspilleur alimentaire par capita au monde. Ce n'est pas juste les pertes là, dans le système de la chaîne d'alimentation. C'est nous, comme consommateurs, à la fin. Ça, c'est le gaspillage. Les pertes jusqu'à l'achat, gaspillage après. Et une des grandes raisons, c'est parce qu'on ne comprend pas, et l'alphabétisation alimentaire au Canada est très faible, en fait. Beaucoup de Canadiens ne savent pas lire l'étiquette, ne comprennent pas, n'ont même pas suffisamment de mathématiques pour comprendre. En anglais, on dit « numeracy skills ». Donc, comment faire les calculs pour comprendre les 2000 kilocalories que j'ai mentionnés au départ? Donc, il me reste 15 secondes. Je vais quand même vous dire qu'en termes de changement climatique, c'est très important. Le Canada a un rôle à jouer. Quand j'ai demandé au PAM récemment, je parlais avec le Beasley, qui est le directeur exécutif, il disait que pour solutionner le monde pour 2030, pour le SDG, l'ODD 2, là, zéro faim, il me faut 40 milliards. On vient de dépenser 300 milliards en COVID juste au Canada pour appuyer les Canadiens. Il y a de l'argent dans le monde, il faut la volonté politique. Le changement climatique, le Canada, petit joueur. Le système alimentaire, c'est 16,5 milliards de tonnes de gaz à effet de serre. 7 à 8 pour l'agriculture. Le Canada, en entier, là, 730 millions. Et l'agriculture, 73 millions. On est un petit joueur, mais on peut être un exemple. Et c'est ce qu'on fait avec les Amériques. Ils viennent au Canada pour voir et apprendre de nous. Alors, on a besoin d'être un leader, en commençant par tous ici, vous et moi, comme solutionnistes. Merci, bonne soirée.
To our speakers, wow, incroyable. Thank you again to Kyung-nan Park, Sophie Gebreyes, Marcel Groleau, Rachel Blais, Melana Roberts, Neil Hetherington, and Jean-Charles Vallée. Global hunger crisis is truly an intersectional issue, and you've shared with us a range of ways that we can take action. Now, at this point, I'm going to invite our talkers to stand up. The rest of you stay here. Those of you online, stay there. We're going to invite them to take a stand and make their way to the reception so they can grab a drink and catch their breath. And while they do that, I'm going to tell the rest of our audience a little bit more about the Walrus Talks. If you enjoyed tonight's event, there's more. Sign up to our newsletter. You can do so if you're in the room. Out at reception, we will have a table. And those of you who are online, we'll be sending up a follow-up email. It's the best way to stay in touch with us in terms of upcoming events taking place online and across the country. Also, consider subscribing to the Walrus. If you're in the room, you have a copy in your hands. I see them. Some of you have already opened them up. For those of you who have attended our event in person, we have a special offer tonight. Just for you, a full year subscription to the Walrus. That's 8 issues delivered straight to your door for just $25. When you make your way to reception, just stop by the Walrus table and our team will set you up. In these very turbulent times, it is crucial that reliable media remains available to everyone. And that's why we depend on your support to keep our journalism accessible and independent. We like to say that the Walrus is a unique beast because we're a registered charity and we do this work thanks to our community of support. So if you enjoyed tonight's event, consider making a donation. You can do so online at thewalrus.ca. Just click on donate or come by the table. All gifts of $20 or more do receive a charitable tax receipt. Thank yous one more time to everyone at Cooperation Canada, Canadian Food Grains Bank, the World Food Program, WFP, and World Vision Canada for making this conversation possible. Thanks as well to the annual sponsors of the Walrus, Air Canada, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, and Shaw. And thanks to all of you for being a part of this event and conversation. Have a great evening. Merci, miigwech. And I look forward to continuing this outside of the reception. See you then.